Should I leave the brazen?
Yeah.
Hey guys. Okay. So I'm going to wait a couple minutes in case more people are intend on joining before I get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Cool. Okay, I guess we're gonna go ahead and get started. Can you guys hear me all right? Let me know in the chat. But last week we finished off with trophic levels, so this week we're going to go into nutrient cycles. If you go back to unit topics. Okay, if we go back to unit topics, last week we sort of covered ecology and levels of biological organization. I'm going to skip macromolecules this week and go into them next week. And then today I'm going to touch on homeostasis and nutrient cycles, which maintain homeostasis, and different types of transport within cells. And that all ties into homeostasis, and then afterwards, I'm going to see how much time we have remaining, and depending on that, we might or might not go into human biology. If not, that's fine, and we'll go into it next week. Cool. I feel like there should be a more efficient way of doing this. Oh, okay. Awesome. Okay, so nutrient cycles. These, fun. Okay. There are 3 nutrient cycles we're going to go over today. I can go back. Okay, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. So these all maintain homeostasis within our environment. Okay, the water cycle. So there are 4 main steps in the water cycle. There's transpiration, evaporation, condensation, and precipitation, and it just goes in a cycle. So first you have transpiration, which is when plants open their pores or stomata for carbon dioxide and lose water through evaporation. And that entire process is called transpiration. So when plants lose their water, evaporation, or that water will evaporate into the sky or into the clouds. Water can also evaporate from bodies of water, or evaporation can also occur from larger bodies of water, such as the ocean or lakes or like a puddle on the road. If you like spill water and leave it for a while, it'll just evaporate on its own. And that is driven by heat. Heat of the sun, but generally heat in general. And after evaporation occurs, it changes into water vapor and rises into the air. And then once that water vapor cools, it changes back into a liquid form called condensation. And then that liquid form will form into rain or snow in the sky, and then it'll precipitate back onto land. Okay, so in this graphic here, we have transpiration here. So one form of evaporation, we have more evaporation coming from the ocean, and then that water vapor turns or condenses and changes back into rain or snow, and that'll precipitate back onto the land. And then you got that sort of surface runoff coming off of these hills or mountains. Cool. Yes, we're gonna go into the nutrient cycle in 1 second. And then, okay, next is the carbon cycle. So do you guys know why can you guys tell me why carbon is so important? Oh, cool. Yeah, carbon is important because plants are made of carbon. It is essentially like the building block for all living things, and even like non-living things, carbon is found everywhere. So it is important that we maintain that homeostasis of carbon. Sorry, I didn't tell you guys what homeostasis meant. In case you didn't know, homeostasis essentially means the balance of things. So we want to make sure there's a balance of carbon within our environment, in our atmosphere and in the ground. So within the carbon cycle, producers convert carbon dioxide, so what we breathe out, back into sugars. And do you guys remember what these producers are? Yeah, producers are plants. So yeah, these producers will convert our CO2 into sugars through a process called photosynthesis. And those sugars are essentially converted back into CO2. And CO2 is also carbon. It's carbon dioxide. And then some carbon can be buried into the ground or in sinks, and these sinks basically just store carbon throughout their lifetime. So trees are sinks, bodies of water are in like super big carbon sinks. Human extraction of fossil fuels bring carbon to the Earth's surface where it can be combusted. So think like mining or cutting down trees, because trees are sinks for carbon. They sequester carbon, they hold carbon throughout their lifetime. When humans extract trees or extract fossil fuels from the ground, so when they cut down trees, all that carbon stored within the tree is released back into the atmosphere. So that's why a lot of people are very passionate about replanting trees so they can maintain that homeostasis, because a lot of construction projects now just cut trees down all the time, and that's shifting the homeostasis of carbon. And then CO2 in the atmosphere and CO2 dissolved in water are constantly exchanged. So we have CO2 in the atmosphere and then an air sea gas exchange within the ocean. So these two are constantly being interchanged. And then combustion converts fossil fuels and plant bacteria into CO2. So human emissions from factories, combustion of fossil fuels. So think like if you drive, I don't think many of you drive, but cars use a lot of gas, and that is a fossil fuel, which emits a lot of carbon dioxide. Okay, and on to the nitrogen cycle. Atmospheric nitrogen, sorry, not oxygen, makes up to nearly 78 or 80% of air. And lightning and bacteria convert nitrogen into usable forms. Just as a general overview, the nitrogen cycle, well, first of all, nitrogen is super vital to life. It is found within our DNA and proteins, which are essential to life, within plants. So it is super important that our bodies and the environment can still use nitrogen. And we use nitrogen through a process called nitrogen fixation, where the atmospheric nitrogen in the air is converted into a usable form in the soil. So a lot of the nitrogen in the air cannot be used by humans or soil, and that's why it needs to be converted through nitrogen fixation. So some of these processes in nitrogen fixation can be natural abiotic processes. So as we mentioned last week, abiotic, what does that mean? Do you guys remember? Abiotic means non-living. Yeah, JJ got it. Also, James asked if we can plant a tree, wait, plant another tree, cut first, wait, cut second, and then cut first. I think I understand what you're saying. We could do that, but like a society doesn't really care that much about cutting down or replanting trees. It would probably be extremely inefficient, and a lot of like architects and builders, a lot of people don't really have that kind of time to sort of wait and then plant, because trees take a long time to grow. So yeah. Yes, that's why trees do take in carbon dioxide. That is why a lot of sort of organizations, private organizations, are dedicated to replanting trees. Plants are vital to our oxygen cycle. Okay, cool. Yeah, so some processes are from natural abiotic processes and some from synthetic abiotic processes. So that would be lightning. Your natural abiotic process would be bacteria. I'm sorry. Natural biotic process would be bacteria. Your synthetic one would be lightning. All right. And then most of nitrogen fixation occurs through nitrogen fixing bacteria. So nitrogen fixing bacteria form a symbiotic relationship with certain plants. So they work with certain plants to supply fixed nitrogen in exchange for sugars. Nitrifying bacteria in the soil convert fixed nitrogen into nitrate, which can be easily taken up by plants. Once available to plants, nitrogen cycles through trophic levels. Sorry, this doesn't make sense. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Once the fixed nitrogen is available to plants, it is ultimately returned back to the soil for reuptake, and that is called nitrogen mineralization. Okay, I know that probably didn't make a lot of sense, but this graphic will help. Right. So you have here the nitrogen or nitrifying bacteria. This is the process of nitrification. You have your nitrogen fixing bacteria, and then through nitrification, it becomes nitrifying bacteria. And then in this process, you have some nitrogen which is released or assimilated into the soil. Your atmospheric nitrogen in the atmosphere is fixated through nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil, and then it keeps going. Okay. Next, we're going to move on to osmosis, diffusion, and transport. So these are different types of transports within cells. These will be essential to know within human biology, and if you're looking more into like the molecular cells. All right, so these are all forms of passive transport. No energy is required. Movement for diffusion and osmosis from high to low concentration. So think of it as a bicycle on a hill. When a bicycle moves down a hill, very little energy is required to make it go down because you have gravity. If you're going up a hill, you have to pedal a lot to get to the top, and that is sort of a metaphor for active transport. But because we're looking at passive transport, sort of a bicycle will easily go down a hill. And think of the hill as the high concentration of cells, and then the bottom of the hill to low concentration of cells. So the bicycle is moving from high to low concentration. And because it's so easy to pedal down a hill, no energy is required. So different types of passive transport are diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. Okay, osmosis is a special type of diffusion of water across a selectively permeable cell membrane. So all of these processes help maintain homeostasis. So look at this graphic right here. On the left side, we have a low concentration of molecules. On the right, we have a higher concentration. There are more here. And these are ions. So osmosis is, you want to make sure, especially if you're taking a biology course, you want to make sure that you know osmosis is the diffusion of water. It's not the diffusion of ions or cells. So if we look at the water level here, because there's a high concentration and a low concentration here, we want to balance out the high concentration of ions with a higher concentration of water. So because you have so little here on the left, they don't need as much water. And that is why in this after graphic, you have more water here to support the larger amount of ions, and you have less water here on the left to support because they don't need as much support. There are 3 types of osmotic solutions, which compare solute concentration. So those sort of ions right there here, that is what the solute is. So you have hypertonic, isotonic, and hypotonic solutions. Hypertonic solutions are when the solute concentration is greater outside the cell than inside the cell. Okay, so here in this graphic, we have a solute concentration that is greater outside of the cell. There aren't many inside the cell. So because there's so much outside the cell, it is more concentrated outside. So the water within this blood cell, this is a red blood cell, will leave the cell, causing the cell to shrink. Because there's less water, it'll cause the cell to shrink. So think of a raisin, a dried fruit. Fruit is typically heavy in water, but put it in a bowl of salt water. Then the grape will shrink and the water outside will move outside of the grape. So yeah, hypertonic solutions occur when the solute concentration is greater outside the cell than inside the cell. Yes. Okay. Logan and Lucas asked to go back to the osmosis page. I'll go back right after explaining these sort of solutions. Okay, next we have isotonic solution. This is when the solute concentration is the same outside and inside the cell, so there is no net movement of water. Take a look at this red blood cell and the solute concentration. This is an isotonic solution, so there's an even amount of water movement going inside and outside of the cell. That's why this cell is not really shrunken down. It's not that small or it's not too big. So it's maintaining that homeostasis. Hypotonic solutions occur when the solute is lower outside the cell than inside. So water moves into the cell. So in a hypotonic solution, think hippo, like the cell will swell up. This is what my biology teacher taught me. The cell will swell up like a hippo or just become really large. Wow, what's that? So this occurs when water moves into the cell. That's what causes this blood cell to swell so much because there's so much water inside. Okay, I'll go back to the osmosis page. Yeah, 3 types of osmosis or osmotic solutions. Okay, just as a quick little understanding check, what happens in a hypotonic solution? Does the cell shrink or expand or stay the same? Yeah. In a hypotonic solution, the cell will become bigger. Yes, like swell like a hippo. What about in an isotonic solution? Isotonic. Yeah, in an isotonic solution, there is no net movement of water, so it stays the same. And then, of course, in hypertonic, by elimination, the cell will shrink. Okay. Moving on to diffusion, which is another form of passive transport. So passive transport, again, is when no energy is required. Occurs when no energy is required. And this time, instead of water, this is just the random movement of molecules from an area of high to low concentration. And this it can apply to water, but it also applies to molecules like carbon dioxide or oxygen and other small uncharged molecules. So this compares osmosis to diffusion. So osmosis, again, is just the transport of water, no molecules. Diffusion is the transport of molecules. So we go from a high concentration to a low concentration. Facilitated diffusion is, again, passive transport, and it moves from a high to low concentration, but this time it utilizes a protein channel through this cell membrane. So here we have normal diffusion. So these are molecules on the outside of the membrane, and these are the molecules inside the membrane. So what is this right here? High or low? Is this a high or low concentration? This cluster of dots. All right, there are a lot more dots on this side of the membrane than there are on the inside of the membrane. This means that on the outside of the membrane, you have a larger amount of molecules, and this is the higher concentration. Inside the membrane, we have the lower concentration, so it moves from a high to low concentration through a membrane. This is diffusion. In comparison, we have facilitated diffusion. In comparison, we have facilitated diffusion to the right, where again, it moves from a high to low concentration, but this time it uses a protein channel. Just something to help the molecules move through the membrane. So yeah, the difference between facilitated diffusion and diffusion is that facilitated diffusion uses a protein channel, this purple rectangle right here, and normal diffusion does not. This example on the left. All right. Moving on to active transport. In comparison to passive transport, which requires no energy, active transport requires ATP energy to complete. ATP energy is what our bodies run on. Is the energy our cells make through cellular respiration, which is a process we'll talk about later. So yes, in comparison to passive, active transport requires energy. And it moves substances from a low concentration to a high concentration. Passive transport moves from a high to low, active moves from low to high. That's why if you're going up a hill, there's a lot of energy required to move from a low concentration to a high concentration. If you're going down a hill, there's very little energy to move from a high concentration to a low concentration. And active transport requires assistance from carrier proteins, which would be like this purple oval in the middle of this cell membrane right here. All right. Okay. Active transport is the big scale movement of materials. So it requires, again, it requires energy, and that energy, and we refer to that energy as ATP. It stands for something you guys will probably learn in a future biology class. I'll put it in the chat if you are curious. That is what ATP stands for. But it's not really something we need to know. Just understand it as the energy we make and the energy we use to undergo like bodily processes made by our cells, made by our mitochondria. So active transport requires this energy, requires this ATP. One form of active transport is endocytosis, which is the movement of materials inside the cell. So this is an image of endocytosis. Here we have the plasma membrane or cell membrane. Here we have like the nucleus, but that doesn't matter. So we have our molecules here, and they sort of end up on this side of the membrane, and it'll be engulfed within the cell and separated as a vesicle, and then just idle within the cell. So endocytosis is one form of active transport. Another form of active transport is exocytosis, which moves waste and neurotransmitters and cell products out of the cell. So just know the difference between endocytosis and exocytosis. You don't really need to know all these definitions, but they're there if you're interested. Endocytosis moves materials inside the cell, and exocytosis moves materials outside the cell. So here is an example of exocytosis. You have a vesicle containing materials. It could be waste. In this case, it is waste. It connects to the cell membrane and then release the waste outside the cell. And this is a form of active transport. So this requires energy to undergo. Because if you see here, there is a low concentration on the outside. There's nothing here. You have your high concentration in this vesicle, and it moves from, oh, sorry, that doesn't apply, but yes, it requires energy to exit. Okay. Okay, yeah, we're going to go into the cell membrane now, which I did mention through forms of active transport, but this will just go a little bit more in depth to the parts of the cell membrane. So now we're getting more on the molecular level. The functions of the cell membrane are to, one, isolate the cytoplasm from the external environment. The cytoplasm is the inside of the cell membrane, or is the inside of the cell, just sort of that gray space. And second, the cell membrane regulates the exchange of substances. So you had your past forms of passive transport, like diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and exocytosis, that cell membrane will regulate what comes in and what goes out. James asked what the wastes were. The waste could be unwanted bacteria within the cell. It could be just excess products of cell processes. So like from the mitochondria, or it could be from the lysosomes, which are organelles within the cell. But yes, that's what waste could be. Okay, or it could be, yeah, okay, I'll just mention those two for now. Okay, and then the third function of the cell membrane is to communicate with other cells, cell communication. So how does one cell tell another cell or send signals to another cell? How do they communicate within each other? Okay, cell membrane regulates what can enter and what can exit the cell. The cell membrane is commonly referred to as semi-permeable, or selectively permeable, meaning it chooses what comes in and what comes out. It consists of two layers of phospholipid molecules, and this is called the bilayer. So here are your phospholipids, these yellow circles with two little tails. You have one layer on top and one layer on the bottom, and this is called the lipid bilayer. Yeah, but so you have your lipid bilayer here, and this entire thing is the cell membrane. All right, here are the components of the membrane. So first we have cholesterol, which helps stabilize the bilayer, and especially in extreme temperatures. So these phospholipids are here, the circle with two tails. These are the phospholipids. They have a polar head and they have non-polar tails. So these heads, these like blue circles, they face the outside of the cell. And on the outside of the cell is essentially water. So they are hydrophilic. Hydrophilic meaning water loving. So they're fine facing the outside of the cell because they are connected to water. However, the non-polar tails, these like two little lines, they are hydrophobic. So they do not want to touch water, which is why they face the inside and are connected like that. And these are all lipids, phospholipids. Cholesterol is just embedded in between each of these phospholipids, or between the cell membranes, to just help stabilize that bilayer so it's less affected by movement. All right. Next, we have transport and channel proteins. So these proteins extend through the width of the membrane for transport of materials into and out of the cell. One example will be an aquaporin, which is passive movement of H2O. Another form is the sodium-potassium pump, which is a form of active transport. Here we have, in this graphic to the right, we have an integral protein that is a transport channel protein. We have a peripheral protein. Here we have some carbohydrates, some lipids, more peripheral proteins within this, again, phospholipid bilayer. So small, like we talked about with passive transport, small uncharged molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide, they are uncharged molecules, easily cross the bilayer through passive transport. So they don't need one of these proteins. Proteins are only required through facilitated diffusion, which is passive transport, or active transport. But typically you do not need a transport protein for, I'm going to sneeze. Oh, sorry, bless me. but typically you do not need a protein for passive transport. Okay. And then of course, water undergoes passive transport through aquapores. So like we talked about osmosis, water can transport through this phospholipid bilayer, but it can also go through an aquapore, which is a form of facilitated fusion. So passive transport with a channel protein. If you guys have any questions, I can definitely repeat things, explain them slower if it helps, but just let me know. All right. So channel proteins act as passageways or tunnels or gates. So they essentially just let molecules go through the membrane. Typically, channel proteins are only used for larger molecules. So your smaller molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide don't typically use these proteins. Then you have receptor proteins, which are used through cell communication. They convey information into the cell, form active sites for molecules to bind to, and then go through. And then you have marker proteins, which are name tags, recognition, and identify each cell. So these are also used in cell communication. They name a cell, they tell other cells what this cell is, with marker proteins. Okay, so again, here we have this phospholipid bilayer. In this graphic, we can actually see the cholesterol. So this is cholesterol within the membrane to help stabilize it. Then you have your channel proteins, these purple ovals. They can be gated or open, or a receptor protein or a marker protein, which are not depicted here, I don't think. Okay, and then the inside of the cell, we have the cytoplasm, and then we have the outside of the cell here. We have some carbohydrates. And then, of course, I already mentioned the phospholipid bilayer. So you have your phospholipids on the bottom and the top with the hydrophobic head and the hydrophilic tail. Okay, I think this is where I'm going to end here. Next week, we'll go more into cell organelles, what happens within the cell. So we'll go through like mitochondria, the nucleus, the nucleolus, the Golgi apparatus and the cytoplasm. And then we'll look at animal cells and plant cells. And then I think we're also going to look at macromolecules. So your proteins, your fats, and your carbohydrates. But otherwise, I think that is it for today. Thank you guys for joining. Logan and Lucas, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Hello?
So,
I'm sorry. I really
so, can you send us the video?
post the video.
Yeah, like, yes, send us or something.
I'm not sure if I'm able to post the video. It is very long. I know Bright Youth Journey sort of holds the videos. If anything, I can try to send you the PowerPoint. I'm still waiting on Bright Youth Journey to get back to me with that, just so you guys can have the notes for yourself.
Because I didn't really because I didn't really like finish all the writing, so.
Yeah, that's okay. I will try to get you guys the notes yourself just so you can have the information with you. Yes, and I will be, sorry. Okay, I will share a Google Drive with you guys in the next class, and I'll have some notes posted there for you guys to follow along or just to have for later. Also, I realized my volume was off the entire period. So I'm sorry if you try to say something and I didn't quite hear you. I didn't mean to ignore you. I just didn't hear you.
Okay, like, okay, so, like, cause, like, will you send us the link for your Google Drive? Cause I don't really have your Google Drive.
Yes, I will send if I cannot reach you guys with the Google Drive before next class through email, then definitely in next class I will have a Google Drive with notes that we've gone through so far uploaded there, that so you guys can just have those.
Okay.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys for coming today. I will see you guys next week. Have a good week.
Bye.
Bye.